Hey guys, it's COREROSS and Rainbow Six News. Today we're doing some direct comparison between the graphics in Rainbow Six Siege and Siege X to try and break down exactly what is changing visually in the game. And also a little disclaimer here. So first of all, we're looking at pre-beta gameplay. That means things can change before the launch. And we're also looking at YouTube compressed videos when it comes to what has been released from Ubisoft about these upgraded maps. So of course, not the best for doing visual comparisons. It'd be better to actually be able to jump into the game and see it ourselves, which we will do when CGX gets here. But until then, this is what we currently have. But it's certainly enough to see where things are changing. And then for any Rainbow Six Siege developer that's watching this, I do apologize, as we're of course going to be very critical of everything to the point of where we'll be critical about things that we're not even going to notice when we play the game in 3 months' time when CGX is launched. And hopefully everyone has a lot of fun. I'm certainly going to have a lot of fun breaking this down, so let's jump in. And the first direct comparison we have is Bank, with Ubisoft themselves giving us a nice shot of before and after. And of course, the big takeaway here is that it's getting a lot brighter, although I think that generally the stuff we've seen seems to indicate the maps are getting a little bit darker and grittier. It is definitely not the case for Bank. And even though this is one of the biggest internal rooms in Rainbow Six Siege, it actually doesn't really show us much here when it comes to graphical changes, other than of course the color palette changing and the brightness. So let's move on to a more boring room, but one that actually helps us understand some of the changes going on. So this is basically the kitchen cafeteria area, and at first glance it might be hard for even a veteran player to notice any real difference here and point it out. But moving over to a comparison screenshot that I have taken, so I've brought the FOV down to what is the default. I've also gone ahead and put on all the fancy graphics that normally Siege players don't have on, like bloom and such, and this is the closest I could get to the same location. And what I noticed right away is there's far more shadows on the floor, and this is a result of much more light sources being used in this room. Previously, the lights on the ceiling were not lit, and as such, they were not casting any kind of shadow below them. You can also see that the ceiling was kind of a glossy texture, and it was actually reflecting the light that doesn't appear to exist in the actual scene. In the new version, they have far more lights being used, and as such, it looks more realistic and a little bit better in contrast. You've got nice light and dark areas running throughout the room, along with the ceiling now being completely matte, no longer reflecting any of these light sources. Now let's move on to the next scene. This one's very good because it's a skylight. It's giving us some direct sunlight coming in above us. And if you were just to show me this picture, I would go, yeah, that's Bank. And I wouldn't even know that it had been upgraded. So let's take a look at what it actually looks in Siege right now. And yeah, I think it's very similar. The only major change I can see here is the tonal shift. The new version looks like it's not got those ugly filters that a lot of games like to add, and Siege is certainly one of them, where it looks quite orange in current game right now, whereas it's much more natural and it actually looks like it's lit by sunlight with that very nice natural look to it. There's also a noticeable bouncing of light off the top of the pillar, which is then reflecting on the ceiling, which you just do not get in the current version of Siege right now. However, I will note this is not ray tracing. There's no ray tracing in Siege X. I'm sure the developers would love to use ray tracing because then they don't have to worry about baking the light into each map. But of course, this is an esports title, so it needs to work on a potato. So they're keeping it with the old tech and just trying to make it look as good as possible. Moving on to the next scene, we have the vault, and this is, and we're going to have probably a few of these as we do the video. This is the one where it looks worse, I think. So here is the shot in Siege right now, and it looks good. It looks really, really good. Going back to Siege X, it doesn't look as good. Like, this is where the red filter on this actually makes it look really nice and kind of gives it some nice depth. Going back to Siege X, it's a bit yellow and it just doesn't look as good. It's unfortunate, it really doesn't. Even the vault door actually looks better in the current version of the game. The shadows look sensational. you've really got a nice depth, and it looks like it's something big and heavy and cast in a big shadow. Whereas in Siege X, again, like the other rooms we've looked at, they appear to have added more lights in. I assume they have more of a budget for adding in more lights with Siege X, and that's what we're seeing here. But the downside when it comes to this, whereas in the other room we've seen the shadows getting casted from the tables and chairs because of the lights above them, the lights here have resulted in the actual shadows of the safe door just disappearing, and it looks like it's kind of just floating there with a uniform light around it. And then moving upstairs, we have our room off the CEO's office, and this looks really good in Siege X. Comparing it to current day, I can definitely see a big improvement here. And the biggest takeaway here for me is the shadows. You'll see in the current version of Rainbow Six Siege, there is no shadows whatsoever being cast by the furniture. Even though there appears to be a very bright light in the room, there is zero shadows. And as a result, in the Siege X version, those shadows just look lovely. Not to mention the lights on the ceiling really pop in this version. And overall, I think it looks really, really good. And this is the first one that I feel like, okay, we're really seeing an improvement here. And moving on from that, we go down to the basement. And this one's really good because we can actually tell a lot about the technology being used here and sometimes the lack of technology. So if we go and look at the current version right now, it's kind of similar, and overall, I wouldn't say there's anything dramatically different. The new version's a little bit more blue, and it's darker, but overall, they haven't really changed too much here. But this is also where we can see the limitations of Siege X, and it's still, it's still a game that's, even though it's getting a graphical upgrade, it's still not current day, right? And as a result, if you look at those pipes at the back, they're not casting any shadows. If you look at the bottoms of the walls where they meet the floor, they really should be a touch darker, and it all just looks quite flat. The only improvement I see overall here is the reflection on the water on the ground, and maybe the brick surface looks a little bit more defined, but overall, I don't see much of an improvement here. And I think this shows that, of course, if they had ray tracing, those pipes would have nice shadows behind them. They would be really quite nice and defined, and you'd get a lot more depth out of this room, and you just don't get that at all. And then moving back upstairs, we got our final scene for the bank, and this one's 50-50. So it looks pretty reasonable. And if you look at the current version, I think the new one is a bit more natural. You can see that very bright area on the left with the skylight with actual sunlight coming in, and then it gets a lot darker to the right hand side where there's less natural light getting there. And overall, it looks a lot better than the current version because the current version has a uniform light throughout. However, some artistic choices here are not the best. So for instance, the bank logo on that back wall there is brown on brown, so you can barely see it. In the current version of Siege, it actually has a cream outline, and as a result, it really pops and it looks quite nice, whereas you just don't have that in Siege X at all. And then let's talk shadows again. So in the current version of Siege, you'll notice that table, even though it's next to the skylight, is not casting any kind of shadow. It looks very much artificial. But if we go look at the new version, it's the same. There's no shadow being cast by that table, and it looks very much like it's sitting there with a kind of universal light all around it. So even though the shadows have been improved in Siege X, it's not like everything suddenly has a shadow where it should be. And as a result, you still end up with bits like this that just don't look real if you start looking too much. Of course, in Siege gameplay, you ain't going to notice that. So the reality of this being any kind of issue is pretty much zero. Now let's move on to Clubhouse, and we start with an exterior view. And not much is changing here. We do have increased detail on the smokestacks with new rings going up, and we have the addition of smoke coming out of this big pipe. But otherwise, the only real difference here is, I would say, a higher contrast between the dark and the light on this exterior view. Going inside, we get a comparison provided by Ubisoft this time, and we can see a very nice before and after shots. And this one is probably one of the more transformative because it really gets a lot darker. However, the metal gets a lot shinier. We got a lot more contrast in here than normal, especially in the back corner and underneath the railing. It is just a lot darker looking and looks very, very nice.
They've also changed the orientation of the light back here, but you'll notice the light that it is casting down remains actually exactly the same as if the light wasn't turned round, showing that the light source in the game engine, of course, is not actually the light in the shape of himself. It is a point, which we'll actually see in another shot. Next, we move into the strip club, and I think the changes here are down to personal preference, if you like it before or after. I think the after shot, the X version, actually looks a bit more hazy, like there's smoke in the air from cigarettes and stuff, which you'll notice in Rainbow Six Siege doesn't really happen a lot. I think adding a layer of haze to stuff would probably give it a bit more depth and grit, which the Siege maps don't have these days. Moving downstairs, the only thing that changes in this room appears to be that it just gets a little bit darker in the darker areas, and the lighter parts remain pretty much the same as it is right now. The only major change that might be kind of unseen in this comparison is the textures, because in the new X version, there is a higher level of textures you can go for, and with this being a YouTube compressed video that we're looking at to compare, it's very possible that we're losing that quality. And I'd recommend to Ubisoft marketing team here, if you want to make a good video on YouTube that shows the graphics in its best possible light, don't have the camera moving through the scene, have it be a stationary shot, because then your compression problems go away as it will get more and more detailed over the next couple of seconds. Moving up to the bar, I think this looks sensational before we even see the comparison picture. And then taking a look at the current day version, it's not just that it doesn't look as good, there is graphical problems here with light spillage underneath the actual bar that just shouldn't be there whatsoever. And that's been fixed in the new one, along with beautiful new lights being added around the perimeter. You'll also notice new lights in the ceiling as well. A lot of the cases we're seeing lights be removed and sometimes moved, but this one actually has a lot of new lights being added into it that really help the scene just look a lot better. And overall, I think it looks sensational and is a nice upgrade overall. And you can even see shadows actually being cast correctly by the shelf as well above the bar. So yeah, really good. Next up, we have a relatively boring room, and this one is actually another great upgrade. So looking at the current day version, it is so two-dimensional, and the new one just looks brilliant. The same lights are on, but they're actually casting shadows, and it looks really good. And this does remind me of like year 1, 2 of Siege. Now, of course, that's with rose-tinted glasses, because these kind of shadows didn't exist back then either. So this is just very, very nice. Moving on from that, we have a nice look into the bathrooms now, and this is good because we see this new gas pipe that is not actually there on the current version, and unlike on Bank, where we just didn't see any shadow behind the actual pipe, this has a correct shadow, and it looks like it's part of the actual scene. And then the large light itself is casting a lot less light than the current version, and overall, I would say probably a decent enough upgrade here. However, I will note that there's a small loss of detail here, as you do have the catches that would be normally holding the door. They've just disappeared. They're gone. However, there are some new bullet impacts on the right-hand side, which I guess they didn't have a firefight before they did this PR video, so they probably are in there all the time. These are not currently present on the live version of the game. Then we move into the tunnel, and this is where I talked about earlier about the light sources not necessarily actually coming from the lights. And in the current version of this tunnel, there's a light on the right hand side, a very bright one. There's no actual light fixture. It is just a point emitting light. There's not even like a sphere or anything there that's actually causing a glow. It is just a point of light. And as a result, it doesn't look good when you start looking at it compared to the new version, where they've actually added in some light fixtures and beautifully lit them with some nice shadows. And overall, this is a nice big upgrade to this tunnel. And again, I'm getting that year 1, year 2 version of Siege coming out through this, and it looks really good. Moving on from this, we're going to Border, and we start off with an exterior picture here, and this is really interesting. So the big takeaway right off the bat is the shadows are really bad. Take into consideration this shadow, and this shadow. If we look at the current day versions with those same shadows, they are way better. Now, I presume they've got the settings at maximum, as I have in my game for this showcase that they're doing. Now, presumably, of course, they're in beta. Maybe this is not perfectly done yet, but those shadows look way worse. This is direct sunlight. The live version of the game gives us really nice sharp shadows that show the definition of the vehicle and stuff like that, and even the corner of the building. However, in the X version, we do see a sharp shadow coming from the light on the right-hand side there. So I don't know if this is potentially a setting that they can tweak to give this sunlight a sharper shadow on the vehicles and other stuff. Maybe something's off with the distance here, but certainly my initial kind of impression here is this is a downgrade over the current version of Border. Then we head inside and go to CCTV. This is where Ubisoft gives us our own direct comparison, and I would say this is kind of a toss-up between which one looks better. The new one is definitely darker in all cases. Where we've seen a lot of the highlights in previous maps stay the same kind of brightness, this actually looks downright all darker, and you can see a really nice shadow that is appearing on the actual desk there that previously did not exist. Then we head down to the server racks, and it looks very good down here. Comparing this to the live version, it's a big upgrade, as there's really no definition down here. It's got that two-dimensional look, and we can see that they've really improved the lighting overall with really nice shadows and highlights, and it looks great. Then we head to the internal courtyard, and this is kind of like the bank lobby we've seen, where the brightness has actually gone up compared to down, whereas a lot of it gets grittier. I'd actually say the live version looks a little bit grittier, and even the shadows are probably about the same darkness overall. You can also see the light spilling in at the top there has disappeared. And with the next shot, we actually see why. So this is probably an artistic choice, I think, because I like the live version. There's obviously direct sunlight hitting where it really should not be, because there's actually a diffusion layer, which is resulting in most of that direct sunlight being at least stopped or diverted out. And as a result, this doesn't look real, but it looks good, and the detail looks superb in the live version, whereas the Siege X one looks worse. However, it's correct, it's far more realistic, but still the live one has way more interest and depth to it, even though it's wrong. And as a result, I think this is more or less a downgrade, and I'd love to see if we can find a halfway point where this could be made it to look a little bit better. Although I'll note, of course, that no one's looking up here, so it doesn't really matter. And then we have another external shot, and this one's kind of interesting because it's kind of two-dimensional. There's not really much of a contrast between the light and the dark, whereas the live version right now actually has more contrast to it. And I would say the X one is more realistic because it's direct sunlight that's bouncing. As a result, there probably shouldn't be the darkest of areas, but I kind of like the live version a touch better. Moving on from that, we have Chalet. So we start with an external picture, and they've actually moved the sun. So the sun is actually in a different location, casting different shadows entirely on this one. And overall, I would say I do prefer the X one. It's a little bit more contrast, with the shadows being a little bit darker. But it is a minor change. Then Ubisoft gives us a direct comparison themselves. And, this one's a tough one, because they, first of all, take away the lights in the ceiling on the right-hand side, which I like, and it's kind of sad to see them go. And they also make that metal artwork above the fire a matte, and it really doesn't look as good. It's far better shiny, and I don't like it being matte compared to the shiny version. And I would say overall, I think that the actual original looks a little bit better. But I will say the original is too bright, the brickwork is too well lit in the original, and the after version is nice and dark. So there is, ups and downs when it comes to this. Then we have the upstairs corridor, and this looks really good, and comparing it to live version right now, it's much, much better. So yeah, big fan of this, and nothing else to really say. Really, really good. And then we head downstairs. We have quite a dark, nice high contrast room here. Comparing this to live, I could totally do a toss-up between each one. There's nothing majorly changing here, and this is interesting because we can see in the X version that they're showing off, they do have destruction. So we talked about those bullet holes earlier in Clubhouse. Maybe they really did go around and actually cause some damage and fire off some weapons before they recorded this. So interesting not to come in and just give us the clean version of the maps. I would also say that the ceiling at the back there, which looks like it has insulation in it in the live version, looks far more two-dimensional and planar in the new version, so we've actually lost a little bit of detail. Then we have the kitchen, and I would say this looks really good with a nice lighting improvement overall, with the old one being quite two-dimensional and definitely this one looking good. They've also taken away that light on the back wall, making the room overall a lot darker. And then we have the ground floor corridor. This is more of the same, where the lighting just looks to have been improved, and it was quite two-dimensional before. Now it looks a lot more three-dimensional. They've also moved a couple of things. That light stick on the ground has been moved away from the bookshelves, and yeah, looks decent, but no major takeaways from it. And then we've got the final map we'll be looking at, which is Cafe, and we're starting here with an exterior shot, and this is a lot whiter than it is in the live version. I do prefer the low sun look, and I kind of like it. It's a bit warmer, a bit nicer, and it matches the skybox in the background, whereas the new one is very white. There's not much of that low sun style light hitting it. And then Ubisoft gives us a direct comparison, and this looks really good. The shiny floors are just shinier with more details. The marble is really popping, and it's kind of similar marble color to what we've seen earlier in Bank. And overall, I'd say a relatively good improvement for this area. Then we've got a very familiar shot that we would probably see a lot when playing this map, where we're looking up to the higher bomb site. And overall, this looks really good in the X version. Looking at the current day one, it looks pretty much exactly the same. There's almost no change that I can really take away from this at all. And if there is anything, it's probably just slightly better textures. This is probably one of the few ones where we can see the lighting has actually not changed at all, at least not noticeably. And then we actually go to somewhere where things are changing dramatically. So right off the bat, you might not notice anything really has changed here, but check out that top artwork. It's actually entirely different. It's still some nude ladies, but it's a totally different piece of artwork now. Now, my current version, just be noted, it bugged out in the replay here. There is no bookcase that should be lying there, even though you can see the books actually floating in the air. So a bit of a bug with just the replay system. But this room has actually had some dramatic changes, and of course the lighting has also been improved to the point of where it's probably a touch better than it was before. Then we move to our next location where we're looking down the stairs, and this is close to the shot where we've seen almost no change. And I would say, again, not a huge amount of change here. Obviously the marble texture has been improved, but the lighting is pretty similar overall. And that artwork in the floor has been made a lot more matte than the previous version that was very shiny. Then we move into the reading room here, and it looks very dark and red. And overall, I like this. It's a very rich looking room, and it plays the part very well in the CGX version. Whereas if you look at the current version, it is a lot more two-dimensional. And we can also see they've taken away a light as well. Then we go to our next location, which is the kitchen. And I think the major upgrades here are simply that of the lighting. But as a result, it looks way better. I can actually see the difference in different counters, whereas in the live version, they all kind of merge together and it's hard to tell one from the other. This, we can actually see where the different sections are, and yeah, looks richer, looks better, looks deeper. Then we move upstairs and we've got a really nice upgrade here, and it's a bit of a broken record for me here, as simply it looks darker, higher contrast, and overall I think the lighting has been significantly improved. We can also see that they've added in more shadows, which just looks really good. And that now brings us to the conclusion. So this is of course coming from someone who is not an expert in this field. I've watched a couple of episodes of Digital Foundry with Alex going over graphics in the past, and that's about the extent of my expertise. So my takeaway here is definitely that they've done a lot of work. They've gone in and basically redone every single map with the graphics, but 50% of it is art style. Deciding to go a little bit darker, a little bit grittier, a little bit more contrast between dark and light, and it's given the maps much more three-dimensionality, and I think they do look really good. And then when it comes to technology, I feel like what we've seen is more shadows and more lights. Sometimes they take away lights as well, but there feels like there's more of a budget they're playing with when it comes to what they can use in the map than previously. This makes me very curious about the last generation consoles, which are still supported in CGX. It says in the FAQ that you cannot play the new game mode, which is the 6v6 mode, but you can play the rest of the game. So I'm curious on the last gen consoles what these new maps will look like, and that really is something I'm fascinated about. And I also wonder if they did ditch the old gen consoles, could they have then pushed what we see here a little bit further? Because presumably they're still working to those limitations in the back end, which means they can't be pushing it too far, right? And is performance still going to stay okay as well on the old gen? So just really, really curious about all that. And I think that's really more of a managerial choice being made there. But yeah, the thing that I'm kind of sad about here is technological upgrades. I really don't see anything being better tech-wise. Like, certainly we've got more shadows, but they're not technically better than the previous stuff. And destructible pieces of furniture that can be entirely destroyed, we've seen it on Bank. They don't have any shadows. If you have a piece of, a piece of furniture that can be completely destroyed, they don't have the baked-in shadows that the indestructible stuff has. So we still have sometimes moments where it looks like a piece of furniture or item is just kind of sitting there, not really interacting with the world around it. And then I do have to do a little critique of the marketing for CGX. And of course, this is coming with hindsight here, as the teaser that we got at the 6th Invitational kind of focused on the graphics. And as such, we were kind of thinking it was going to be quite a major upgrade when it comes to the graphical fidelity of the game. But what we see here is an incremental upgrade, where definitely it looks better in a lot of cases, but sometimes there's a few cases where it doesn't, and the technology doesn't appear to have been bumped up to a significant level to make this kind of a major feature, which is sad because obviously a ton of time would have to be put into just going through every single map, upgrading every single texture, redoing the lighting, redoing the shadows, redoing everything. I can't imagine how much time it takes to do just one of these maps. And of course, when it came to the full reveal for CGX, the headline feature was actually the new game mode. And I feel like if maybe the teaser at the 6th Invitational had been a bit more focused on that, like just simply said, there's a new game mode coming, maybe we would have been a bit better expectation-wise when we got the full reveal. Whereas honestly, I was expecting a bit more graphical fidelity than we appear to be getting. Now, again, we'll go back to that original disclaimer that this is from a YouTube video that we're looking at here and comparing it. It is still possible that we jump into these maps in CGX and go, holy crap, it looks so much better. And, once it's out of beta, it ends up looking sensational. But my expectations now are that we're getting an incremental change where there will be a few places that will look like downgrades, but I think the majority look better, look darker, grittier, and have a more year one, year two aesthetic kind of feel. But that's with rose tinted glasses. I think these will look sensational. And if I was to actually go back and compare these to the OG maps, I think we'd probably see that these ones are just way more superior. That would probably be a far starker difference than we would expect if we just look, because we're looking at that through the rose tinted glasses. I think we went back and actually took a look at it, it would be dramatically better with CGX. But certainly, I think it's clear that the new game mode is the headline feature and deserves that headline feature kind of stance. Whereas the graphical changes here, even though they've taken a lot of time to make them, I doubt they are really up there as a headline feature, which is unfortunate, but that's my kind of opinion on it. Anyway, guys, I'd love to have your feedback in the comments below as well. I'll catch you next time. And sorry this video has been so freaking long as well. It was way longer than I was planning to. And my voice is gone because I got a sore throat. I've been like no voice for the last couple of days. So that's been terrible. Anyway, thanks for watching. Catch you next time.